Hi, this is Mike from Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and on today's video we'll be doing a approximately £400 gaming PC build with a few little tweaks and twists to get you gaming in 2021. Keep watching to find out more. Okay, so in today's video we'll be taking a look at how to put together a gaming PC which costs around about £400 here in the UK. It's a micro ATX form factor. It is using a Ryzen 5 3400G, so graphics and processing all done on one processor, so that's going to save us trying to get hold of a graphics card, which, as most of you know at the moment, is still a little bit problematic, although things are starting to get better, hence why this build is going together. The 3400G is actually a really good little processor, and if you combine it with a GPU later on down the line, it's going to give you a lot of enjoyment and some longevity. So let's go through and introduce the parts. Okay, so let's go ahead and introduce the parts. So first of all, because this is a micro ATX build, obviously we need a micro ATX case. So the case we're using this one is going to be the Neutron Labs. This is the Hacker M3. This case comes in to us at around about £30. So excellent value for money, tempered glass side panel, you've got some RGB illumination, a little bit of ventilation on the front, and a generally all-round decent build quality. Full review, if you want to see it, is up here. Next up, because this is a micro ATX case, obviously we need to have a micro ATX motherboard. So in this particular instance, we've gone with the MSI, the B450M Mortar Max. This is a great little board, comes in the UK around about £50 at the moment, has a really good VRM, it's going to be absolutely perfect for the processor we're putting on here, and also gives us a little bit of upgradability. It will take up to a 5950X processor should you wish to, although that's probably a little bit of an unrealistic option, but certainly it can do if you need to. It is a B450 chipset, so compatibility wise you've got a really wide gamut of processors you can use with it, and also it does support things like dual M.2, and you've got USB Type-C, and you've got some really good outputs for the APU, both DisplayPort and HDMI 2.0B. Processor wise, as we've said, we're going with the Ryzen 5 3400G. This is the Pro version. Managed to pick this one up for around about £150, so not a bad price. Would have been great if it was a little bit cheaper, but certainly again in this economic climate as things are at the moment, not a bad deal at all, and being that it combines both CPU tasks and GPU tasks, potentially we've saved some money. RAM wise, we're looking at a little bit of future proofing with this, so we're going with the Klevv Cras X. Now this is a 16 gig kit of DDR4 3600. This stuff overclocks like crazy. Realistically, with this particular processor, we may not get much higher than around about 3200, maybe 3433, something along those lines, but we certainly will be playing with that. One of the real reasons of getting this board is because the overclocking option, so hopefully we'll be able to overclock the RAM and also the VGA on board, and obviously the processor itself. And of course, if we're going to be overclocking, then we're going to need to be cooling. Now this was a OEM tray processor, so we didn't get the stock cooler with it, so we've gone in this particular version with the Uphere 120mm ARGB cooler. So this is a 120mm tower cooler. It's got a really nice blacked out design to it, and of course addressable RGB lighting, which will tie in with the rest of the case. This is going to be great for cooling this chip, and also again if you want to upgrade later down the line, maybe put in a 3600X or 5600X even, this is going to be absolutely fine for those kinds of processors. And to power the whole lot, we're using a Aerocool Integrator 700 watt power supply. Now one of the reasons for this is it's got a ton of connectivity on it, it's also got flat back cables. It isn't a particularly high-end power supply, but again for this kind of setup it's more than adequate, and being that it's got that 700 watt rating, although we're probably never going to get it anywhere near that, if you wanted to put a graphics card in at a later date, that's going to be a really easy thing to do. Other notable mentions, we've got the Intenso SSD, so this is an M.2 SSD based around the SATA interface, so this is going to be absolutely fine. 512 gigabytes, fantastic for putting Windows on, and also some relatively large games. Of course, being this motherboard has got two M.2 slots, we can always add another M.2 drive should we wish to, and also we've got 4 regular SATA ports, so if you want to put in some mechanical storage for vast backups of loads and loads of Steam games and libraries, that kind of thing, no problems there either. Another notable addition is a UBIT card, so this has got both Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. This board unfortunately doesn't come with either of those built in, so it's one of those things which is nice to have, especially if we're going to put this PC together to possibly pass it on to someone, get some use out of it. Wi-Fi and Bluetooth are some of those things that people do request these days. Obviously, if you don't need that, you can omit it and take it off the price of the build. Those come in around about £20. The cooler itself was about £29, and the power supply was about £35. So all in, with everything included as is, you're looking just a shade over £400. If you were to use the retail version of the 3400G and remove the Wi-Fi card, I think you could definitely bring this in at under £400. So that's the parts introduced, let's get on and build this thing. So let's begin the build. The first thing we're going to do is to get everything we can actually assembled onto the motherboard itself. Being that this is the APU, a lot of it is actually going to be integrated within the CPU. We've got an M.2 drive, so we don't need to worry about SATA cables or anything like that. And also we can plug in the RAM. And quite often you'll find that installing a CPU cooler is considerably easier, especially with things like spring clips on the side, if you mount it all on there before you actually put it into the case. So let's get started. So the first thing we need to do is remove the standard clips which come with the motherboard, as our cooler uses a different mounting system. Obviously, depending on what cooler you need or that you're using, then you can put on the appropriate clips for your particular cooler. If you're using the stock AMD cooler, you will also need to remove these plastic clips. Make sure when you put them to one side, put them somewhere safe, just in case you ever need to return the motherboard for any reason, or perhaps if you're selling it on and you want to give the end user the option to reuse those clips, it's a good idea to put them in the motherboard box, something along those lines. Okay, so we've got the CPU cooler backplate on, and we put the standoffs in place. So the next thing to do is to open the arm to put our processor in, and with AMD AM4 just look for the golden tag in the corner, and that goes into the bottom corner, or alternatively just read the writing on there where it says socket AM4 and just make sure that Ryzen looks the same way. Once it's in place, put the lever down and that will lock the processor into place. Now it's time to put some thermal compound onto the processor. So the Uphere cooler comes with some thermal compound, so we'll use their own, and all we need is a tiny little blob on the top. And that might be a little bit too much actually, less is more generally with thermal compound. So the next thing to do is to put the additional mounting bracket on the top. One thing I would say about this cooler, as I did say in the main review, is the actual mounting bracket and the whole process is a little bit over the top really. Works okay, but is a little bit of a pain. And don't assemble it all before you put your processor in, because if you do, you won't be able to lift the arm up to actually put the socket or put the CPU into the socket. So when they're on, just go around and tighten them up, just hand tight. I generally get it so the thread is kind of level with the top of the screw. So make sure it's not sticking out too far. So there we go, that's fine. So now we can actually go ahead and put the CPU cooler on the top. So now we're going to drop the cooler into place, so that just plops over the top there. And then there's two mounting screws, which are these ones, and you put one on each side. Unfortunately you can't really see the other side, so I'll twist that round. And there you go, so there's one on each side. A little bit tricky to get to, so you might need a slightly longer screwdriver. They don't actually include one in the box, which is actually quite a shame. Luckily the tension actually on the springs isn't too bad, so you can at least get the screws started a little bit. Let's do one side, give it a few turns. And then we'll do the same roughly on the other side. And essentially we just need to keep on doing this until the screws won't turn anymore. To attach the fan, there's just some spring clips on the side, so just hook those over. And just clip on both sides and just make sure the fan isn't obstructed by anything. And then you can tuck your wires out of the way and reconnect anything which has been disconnected. Whilst we're on this side, actually we can hook up the CPU PWM connector onto the motherboard header. And that just plops into place, and then you can leave the wires wherever you want. We're probably going to cable manage this out the top of the chassis when the build is finished. Also, the addressable RGB cable is going to go to the actual hub built into the case. So next up, we're going to install our Intenso drive, the M.2 SSD top, 512 gig. So the first thing we'll do is to remove the small screw if it's already on your motherboard. Chances are you'll probably find that your screw isn't already in. I always put mine in just so I can keep track of them so they don't get lost. And put the drive in, fingers in, and just give it a little wiggle, make sure it's firmly attached. When you're happy that it's attached, then a little bit of pressure on the top there, and then you can put the screw back in. When you're screwing up an M.2 drive, don't screw it too much. It just needs to be holding in place, doesn't really need to be kind of torqued or anything. So as long as the drive isn't moving, that's absolutely fine. If you've got any heat sinks or anything at this time, then you can go ahead and install them. But that is that's the storage done. So next we can install our RAM. So we need to use slots 2 and 4. So if you count away from the CPU, so 1, 2, 3, 4. So we want 2 and 4. So just open up the retention clips and then we can install our RAM. So the RAM, this is the Cras X RGB, and what you want to do is to take a look at the pin on the bottom there, or the notch, and line that up with your motherboard. This used to be a lot easier when the notch was even more offset than it is now. Snap them into place. Don't physically snap them. That's a bad idea. You can, if you want to, put a bit of pressure in the middle and just give them a little wiggle just to make sure they're firmly installed, but that is it for the RAM. So the next part is to prepare the case. So taking the case, this is the Hacker M3 from Neutron Labs. Nice little case actually, plenty of room to work in, loads of cable management space, or at least it appears to be, so we will certainly find out as we go through the build. What I generally like to do is to kind of separate some of the cables up. So as you can see at the moment, these are our RGB cables, which is all the inbuilt RGB stuff, so that's kind of been separated to some extent. And then we've got our bunch here, which is our front panel I/O, also things like HD audio, that kind of thing. So separate as much as you can. That will make wiring much easier and a little bit less confusing. At this point, it's a good idea obviously to install your hard disk drives, that kind of thing. If you want to put a hard disk drive in, this one's really easy. It does have a removable cage, so you can mount a drive in there and then slot it all back in and do the appropriate wiring. Now, we're not putting a hard disk drive in this particular machine, but I am going to leave the caddy in there just in case the end user, or me, if I decide to keep this machine, if we want to put a drive in at a later date for maybe mass storage, videos, that kind of stuff. But what we want to do now is actually install the power supply. So this is the power supply bay, and we've got our power supply here, which is the Aerocool integrator 700 watt. We've got a ton of cables here as well, which we need to manage, but luckily we don't really need to use many at all. Literally, main motherboard power supply, 24-pin power supply, EPS power supply, and a couple of SATAs. Although technically this is Molex, so we're going to use some Molex as well for the RGB. But other than that, the rest can be cable managed away for a later date. So to install the power supply, actually very simple. All you do is put the power supply in from the side there, and just put it into position. The screws on the back all mount up roughly where they're meant to be, and then you put 4 screws in. Your power supply might come with screws included. Ours didn't appear to, so I'm going to grab some screws. Okay, so now we've got our power supply in place, and we're going to be using the coarse screwed screws. And all we need to do is to kind of push the power supply into approximately the right position, so the screws line up at the bottom. And I would say on most PCs you're probably best off just putting these in a little bit loosely around the 4 edges. And on the last one you can actually tighten it up fully. Then just do them in a crisscross. Don't need to be overly tight, just as long as the power supply is held in position. Luckily it's in the basement, so even if it's loose it's not going to go very far anyway. So that's our power supply installed. So now we're going to put the I/O shield in. So get your I/O shield orientated the right way, and from the inside line up the corners. I generally try and do one corner first, push it through, and it should pop into place. Some motherboards have these already built in, but if not, you do have to push it into place yourself. So let's put the motherboard in next. So next thing to do is to put the motherboard into the case. So with this particular one, because we've got a few cables, just try and make sure that they're tucked out the way so they're not going to get trapped. And also, if you've got any motherboard cables or cables coming from fans, etc., just try and pull those out the way. So drop the motherboard in and underneath, making sure not to snag any of those cables, and then just line up the rear I/O shield, and it should put it in together. Some boards have actually got like a locking pin. This one actually has, so the board is actually pretty firmly in place there, I believe. So let's get one screw in to start with. I generally try and start with the center pin. And do that up so it's moderately tight, but not totally tight. I would say, depending on your motherboard, I'd put in all the screws and just put them in relatively kind of hand tight. Don't really cinch them right the way down, right until the very end, and then you can make sure that everything matches up. Should you need to do any kind of twisting of the board or any movement, if you've got a slightly cheaper case, sometimes you might need to actually give the board a little bit of a wiggle to get into its final position. So I'm going to go ahead and put the rest of the screws in, and then we can carry on with the cable management. Okay, so the motherboard is now installed, as you can see, and yeah, it's looking pretty good. The cooler in there is pretty much dominating the entire outlook of everything in there. But yeah, that is pretty much looking pretty sweet. Actually looks a very clean install. Sadly, now we've got to do something with yeah, all this. So now we can get some cable management done. So what we're going to do is going to separate the cables up again, just in case. So there is our front I/O, we'll put that to one side. We've got our addressable RGB stuff going on here, so we'll pull this out of the way. That is going to be stuff we can do a little bit later on. So what we need to do is to actually concentrate on the power management side of things. So the cables we're going to need for this particular installation are, well, we don't need that one, that's the GPU cable, so that one can be tucked out of the way. We have got a SATA cable here, we don't need those either, so we can tuck those out of the way. We do need some MOLEX connectors for the RGB side of things, so we'll keep those, we do need those, but not quite yet. So the only ones left are our main 24-pin power connector, and we can go ahead and just route that through either this hole here or this one here. Let's take a look on the other side, and I think we'll go with the upper one. That's going to be closer to where our socket is, so push that through, and then we can cable manage the rest of that when we know how much length we've got left. And the last one is our CPU connector. So this is the split 2 lots of 4 into an 8-pin, so this is our main EPS power connector for the CPU, which is going to go up in through this corner up here. So all we need to do is just push it through all the way just so you've got plenty of length there, and then we can spin it around, plug those in, and then we can look at other cable management options. One thing you can do before you carry on, if you want to, the additional cables, the ones we're not going to use, we've got our SATA, another SATA, and our GPU connector. I tend to bunch these up just so that they're a little bit more easy to manage, and then what we could always do is pop them back in underneath, and they can be stored out of the way until we actually come to use them. Again, it's entirely up to you how you go about doing your own cable management. Some people find certain things work better than others. For me, that's going to make it nice and tidy, and as you can see, hopefully already, it's actually pretty clean and pretty clear underneath there. So let's plug in the connectors around the other side. So now we're going to come across one of the problems which you often experience with a micro ATX build, especially one which has got a relatively low top chassis, is actually trying to get your hand in here to our EPS connector, which you can probably just about see there at the top. So we need to get in and plug that one in, and we need to do our CPU connector. And the CPU connector is going to be really easy. That's our 24-pin, so just line that up and it should snap into position. You can probably just about heard the click there. Now you can push through any cable you don't need. And let's see if we can grab our 8-pin at the top there and find out which way round it goes. I did a little bit of moving around off camera because it was really tricky, but got it into place now, so just push that into place and that is firmly connected. So that is essentially it. That's all we need for power for the board, which is pretty crazy really. So we can go back now, cable manage our power, and then we can look at our I/O connectivity. Okay, so we've made a start on the cable management, as you can probably see. So what we've done is we've bunched up all the addressable RGB cables. I've taken those all along the top channel, and then we've got our MOLEX connector up here in this top corner, and all of that section is running down back to the power supply. Then I've taken 2 strips, so one is for the I/O, which is this one here, and the next one is for the power for the motherboard. So what I've done is I've cable tied those down so they look nice and clean, and I've pushed all the cables all the way through. Now there is an additional cable. This is a addressable RGB pass-through for the actual case itself. Sadly, this board doesn't have addressable RGB, so this isn't going to be used, but I figured I'll show you it anyway. What I'll do is I'll just tuck it underneath, so if there's a motherboard swap out at some point in the future, then we can still use that connector and it'll still be easily accessible. So moving around to the front, we can see now we've got our cables passed through for our I/O. So we've got our front panel connectors, we've got our USB, USB 3, and our HD audio. All those are passed through the appropriate holes at the bottom. So what I generally tend to do is plug those into the motherboard. Passing the cables through as far as they'll possibly go is always a good idea because it gives you a little bit more flexibility. That is the last bit. Once you've connected that in, then you can pop the cables back through and then cable manage the remainder which is left over, which is my personal way of doing it. So I'm going to carry on and do that, and then we'll be back with the finished product. So there we go, that is the finished product, and actually it looks pretty decent. It's very clean looking, and when we get the back panel on, it will look considerably better. So all the cables have been pushed back through now. The cutouts are actually in a pretty decent place on this board. If we spin round, you can see on the back there, that is looking pretty darn clean. So the only thing left to do now is to get it fired up and do some tests. So we'll be back after that. Okay, so we're finished with the build, everything's done. We've done some gaming, done some testing, done some temp tests. Sadly, the case isn't particularly great with airflow, which is no great surprise. Obviously, there is only some small mesh at the front and there aren't any extra fans included. I have left it in the stock configuration, but even so, with that, with the Ryzen 5 3400G, in games and playing, and the day has been extremely hot here in the UK. We've experienced some extremely high temperatures. It's around about 28 to 30 degrees in the house, so it is particularly warm. So take that into consideration. But saying that, with the CPU cooler, we did manage to get in the region of about 71, 72 degrees. So if you take that off of the actual ambient temperature, it isn't actually that bad. And it was actually worse than that originally. I did use the original thermal compound that come with the Uphere cooler, and I don't think it's the best of compounds. So I did take the cooler off, reseat it, use some Arctic MX4, and put it all back together again. I did notice again with that cooler, like I did in the review, that the actual screw down mechanism does get loose after a while. So if you're installing it for the first time, you want to let the system bed in for a couple of hours, get it hot, then let it cool down again, and then do up all those screws just to make sure it's all nice and firm and tight. But other than that, yeah, the fan does a reasonable job. If anything, of the entire build, actually, the only thing I probably would have changed is actually the CPU cooler. I would have much rather gone with something like the Evo 212 or maybe the Arctic Freezer 34, something along those lines. I think that would have been a much better bet. Or even the trusty Snowman, the MT4, would have been actually really good in here, and is only around about £20 if you can wait for it to be delivered from AliExpress. So the burning question is the PC actually any good? And actually, yes it is. We've chatted with 3 games today specifically. We've done Fortnite, we've done CSGO, and we've done Wreckfest. And actually all of them were absolutely great. Totally playable, very enjoyable, 1080p, mixtures of medium, high and low settings. It still is very, very playable. Wreckfest, I would say, is probably the hardest one to run. Got tons of textures, lots of cars, lots of AI stuff going on. And that actually still played very well. Looking around about sort of 45 frames per second is a kind of average. Did peak up into the 60s and did dip down into some of the 30s, which is totally expectable for that sort of game. Even with an RX 5700 XT, that still struggles at 1440p at some times. So that's actually, for an APU, it's done a fantastic job. And especially when you look at the price point, all of this, all rounded up together, is pretty much a steal. The 3400G still amazes me, the fact that that little processor can do all those things with 4 threads, 8 cores, and still play games. It really is phenomenal. So let's take a look at some of the gameplay footage. So as you can see, first of all, with Wreckfest, this is a pretty heavily populated map, plenty of cars, lots of stuff going on. You've got lots of AI effects, you've got debris everywhere, so there's lots of physics going on also, and it still plays particularly well. I really do enjoy this game. We have actually got a Wreckfest server, so if you want to look up the Wreckfest server, we'll put some links for that in the video description below, so you can join us if you want to. Thanks to Cosmic Space Muffin, who actually has done or created that server and is hosting it for us at his house. Bless you, Cosmic, we do appreciate it. So moving on from Wreckfest, we've also got Fortnite, and we've played some of the latest Fortnite version in there. And again, with a mixture of various settings in there, still 1080p, it still looks and plays really, really well. And the frame rate, as it often is in Fortnite, does kind of jump all over the place depending where you are in the map, whether it's highly populated, whether there's lots of people around, wide open spaces, epic views, all that kind of stuff. We have got this set to epic view, which I think is the optimum solution for this, but even still, extremely playable. Frame rates anywhere from the kind of mid 60s up to kind of 150 plus, so a really good playable experience. And if you're using a monitor that supports FreeSync and that sort of thing, you're going to have an absolutely great time. Moving on to CSGO. CSGO, one of the old favourites, and even though it does technically run on a potato, to actually get it to run nicely, smoothly, and with a reasonable level of fidelity, it still does actually tax even the most modern systems. In this game, pretty decent. The game well in excess of the 60 frames per second. You can obviously tweak it to get the frame rate even higher if you want to for competitive gameplay, but certainly as just a good fun title with lots going on, a super popular game, it handled it extremely well. And again, temperatures in and around the kind of 60 to 70 degree mark on the CPU. And don't forget, obviously, that is CPU and GPU combined in one unit. So I think, again, this is done fantastically well. Looking at something else like Cinebench. Cinebench, obviously, quite a demanding title for the actual processor, and this is where we really stressed the CPU cooler, and we did see temperatures spiking up into the high 70s. So yeah, not ideal, especially being that today was an extremely warm day, but still it did it, and throttling wasn't particularly noticeable. Anytime the processor did throttle a little bit, it soon jumped back up to the previous frequencies, and it wasn't a problem at all. It wasn't a case where it was overheating and gasping for air or breath. It just carried on, did its thing, and actually got a reasonable score. So there you go, we've seen some gameplay. We know how much this costs, and actually for those of you that are not sure how much it all costs, we'll run for it again. So the case itself, we're looking around about £30. The CPU we paid about 150 for, that's for that Ryzen 5 3400G. The motherboard was an absolute steal at £50. The RAM is one of those weird ones where RGB RAM does cost a little bit more. We could have gone with cheaper DDR4 3200, but we got 3600, so at least when processor prices dip and when GPU prices dip, we can take out that 3400G, put in a 3600 or a 5600 and a decent graphics card, and still get tons of enjoyment out of this little system. SSD in this one, again, is the Intenso. This is a 512 SSD. I did originally put it in the bottom slot, but the bottom slot is NVMe only, so I did have to put it into the top slot, which was yeah, a bit of a rookie error, but still, we get there in the end. The cooler, again, £30. Not the best. I should have said, actually, the SSD is about £35, so pretty good value for money there. Power supply wise, yeah, it's done absolutely fine. Doesn't give out hardly any heat at all. Realistically, the CPU is kind of pulling in about 70 watts, that sort of thing. It isn't particularly power hungry, so the whole system, if I put it on a wall meter, we're probably looking at about 100 watts in total, if that. So it's actually pretty efficient, even when gaming. Really, really good value for money. I really like this system. The CPU cooler, again, like we said, this is the one thing which I probably would change. It's okay, it does its job, and in this particular setup, I think it actually does look really nice. I do like those kind of blades and the stripes down the side. I think it does give it a really nice look. And hopefully, if I decide not to keep this for myself, and if I do choose to sell it, then I think that is going to be one of the things which will draw people in, that lure of the RGB. So all in all, this has cost us approximately £400. I did eventually omit the wireless card, purely because I don't need it. I've got LAN cable here. Obviously, if I do choose to sell it, then it's really simple just to put one of those cards in and give somebody wireless and Bluetooth connectivity. So I think that's going to be pretty much it for this system build. Again, all of this for around about £400, I think is fantastic. You can play pretty much any game within reason, as long as you don't mind lowering your expectations and possibly lowering your resolution. So let me know what you think about this one in the comment section below. Let me know, for £400, what would you buy? What would you do differently? Can you do better? If you can, post your PC part picker links in our Discord and I'll definitely check them out. And if your PC part picker list is spectacular, then maybe I'll actually build it for myself. So let me know what you think in the comments section. In the meantime, I've been Mike. This is Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and hopefully we'll catch you in the very next video. Thanks for watching.